here's a square 1. Here is a square 2. And here is a square 4. These are reasonably well-established puzzles. But what's a square 3? You might be thinking of this, but it's actually something called the Square-3 Plus, which is in a different series. It's a piece swap mod with the top layer of a square 1 and the bottom layer of a square 2. The idea being that 1 plus 2 equals to 3, giving the puzzle its name. When I originally sent this puzzle to Calvin of Calvin's Puzzle, I suggested several names for it, none of which were what it ended up as. Calvin initially actually wanted to call it just the Square-3, but we ended up compromising with the plus at the end, which was the least I could do to at least not have this basic piece swap take the name of another puzzle. Anyway, due to being at least partially responsible for this confusion, I felt it necessary for me to make a real Square-3. Here it is. Originally created by an anonymous Twisty Puzzles forum member in May of 2008, it is a square 2 with the edges cut in half. You may notice that these 4 puzzles all follow the same rule. The amount of parts on one layer follows the formula 8 plus 4 times n minus 1, where n is the number after the word square in the puzzle's name. This is an overcomplicated way of saying each puzzle just has 4 more parts than the previous one. I actually once designed a floppy Super Square 3 years ago, based on the floppy Super Square 4 mechanism, but I've never personally made or actually had one of these. Maybe at some point I should go ahead and print one out. It might genuinely be interesting to solve. In any case, the Square 3 has never been mass produced, so I had to design one for myself. I just reused the same Square 1 mechanism I have used in several puzzles before this one, just slicing it appropriately. I also made the central layer cut line up with the split in the edges, so that turns could be made without offsetting the top and bottom layers. So that's a conceptual overview of what the Square 3 is and why you should care. So now let's get into how I built it. A puzzle with a basic square 1 mechanism is generally one of the simplest types of puzzles to assemble. You just put all of the appropriate outer layer parts on the 2 halves of the central layer, and then screw the central layer together. The center cap's design may differ depending on the axis of rotation, but I find that the best practice is to have it be either the same size or slightly bigger than the sticker that goes on it. That way, disassembling the puzzle later won't require removing any stickers. Generally, all of the parts will be pretty tight going into the puzzle, which is why I use a generous amount of lube in the central layer before adding any parts. I've been using the same small bottle of Traxxas 10K since I first started building puzzles in 2018, and it's just now becoming almost empty. Pretty solid deal, huh? I don't imagine this lube is particularly good for speed cubing, but for 3D printed parts where you really want a thicker lube, it works really nicely. After assembling the Square 3, I had to break it in. I believe this should generally be done to some extent before the puzzle is stickered, as it can show you if something is not right with the design before you go ahead and actually go to the effort of cutting stickers. Generally, puzzles like this will be incredibly stiff and difficult to turn initially, so you have to put a ton of force into first turns. After turning them for a bit, the lube will spread itself around the mechanism and make for a much more smoothly turning face. I personally believe this is better than having a mechanism that initially turns well upon assembly, but then becomes very loose once it actually breaks in. Unfortunately, you can't tension the top and bottom layers of a typical Square 1 mechanism, so all you can really do is design your clearances in the mechanism well. After breaking in a 3D printed puzzle, the next step is going to be sanding its external faces for better sticker adhesion. I used to skip this step, and while it did save a significant amount of time, I now have a bunch of puzzles in my collection with stickers peeling off, so honestly, smoothing out the sticker faces is something that's non-negotiable. I'm gonna finish breaking in the puzzle and then get back to you when it's sanded. So here's the Square-3 after sanding. It looks like any other sanded puzzle, honestly, but in this build I've actually been experimenting a bit. You see, I recently decided to put to use a belt sander that I've had for a while but never tried using for puzzles. I decided to test out grits and techniques that might be suitable for a puzzle. So here was my first attempt at 80 grit, and here was 80 grit with a slightly better technique. This was not brilliant. I then tried 120, and this was also not great, although it was definitely an improvement. Finally, I tried 240, which this was the first one that I started to consider actually usable. And then this one was 240, but with better technique. And you can see that the surface finish on this is actually really decent. This feels really smooth, although some of these parts, it's kind of a different type of smoothness, honestly. These just, your finger glides along, but these are still a tiny bit rough. Like, you definitely feel some particles there. So I'm actually treating this as kind of an experiment to see if this type of smoothness will also hold stickers. By the way, don't feel bad for this cube. This was a failed prototype of the Square-3 that wasn't going to be used no matter what. I was 100% going to make the second one. Now, how I made the belt sanding more palatable, which by the way, I don't recommend doing belt sanding if you're new to this. Definitely get it if you're making a decent amount of puzzles semi-frequently, but if you're just starting out and you don't have one yet, a much better purchase would be a vinyl cutter. But yeah, so you can see that I printed this box that's meant to fit a 60mm puzzle. And the idea is you hold the box, and that way you're not even coming near the belt, because the face of the puzzle is slightly exposed here. And then you even get this convenient hole so you can push the puzzle out. But when I actually started to use this box, I came across an issue. What do you think happens when you sand a puzzle? It gets smaller. So that meant this was no longer a snug fit, and it just fell out onto the belt sander. To this, I devised a hilariously simple solution of just putting some amount of paper towel strips on the puzzle until it was a snug fit. So this one strip, it's still a bit loose, although actually not that loose, so we put on this second layer of paper towel, and now this isn't going anywhere. Yeah, and you definitely want to be really careful with making sure it's a snug fit if you're using the paper towel method, because if you actually look at this blemish here, this was caused by me actually only having one paper towel in here and not two, at a time when all of the other faces beforehand only actually needed one paper towel, so I was just continuing with that. But it needed two, and it didn't have two, so it fell out onto the belt sander, and this kind of corner got chipped off. I think that the outside fillets are thick enough that the sticker template might not be too affected by this, but I mean, it's not brilliant to just have a chunk missing of your puzzle. Overall though, this thing actually turns pretty well. I'm not doing this right now because I don't have the time and it would be a little bit of effort, but I've been thinking, what if I design a box similar to this, but instead of exposing just a tiny bit of the puzzle, it exposes a layer, and then I could put a second box which is smaller onto this layer, and that second box would essentially have kind of a opening for a drill bit, so that way if you want to break in a puzzle pretty quickly, you could just set that up and have at it. I don't know if it would work that well on this, because when you're making these turns, sometimes, not often, but sometimes it has a tendency to kind of catch and make a vertical turn, so I'm just throwing ideas out here. I didn't need to do any of this for the puzzle. I could have easily just sanded this manually and not thought about breaking it in any more efficiently. But, I mean, this is a type of puzzle where, honestly, it's pretty basic. It's really hard to mess up. Ignore the fact that I have a failed prototype. And, yeah, honestly, I felt like seeing if I could improve my workflow a bit. So, speaking of experiments, normally I just sticker this up and go film with it. But I'm actually going to try something new with this. What I'm going to do is put in this cap, and then what I'm going to do is put this down on like a cardboard box that's been ripped apart, and actually spray paint this with clear coat. I'm using fast drying clear coat that takes about 15 minutes to dry, so I'm going to spray the first 3 sides, wait until everything's dry, flip it over, and then spray the other 3 sides. I've been told that this will actually bring back the black finish of the cube and should result in a good surface for the stickers to adhere to. So maybe that will placate my concerns about some of these smooth faces actually being able to feel some particles. The other thing that I haven't totally figured out is once you do sand a puzzle, and this is belt sander, nail file, regular sander, I haven't figured out a great way to actually get all of the minute dust out of the puzzle without, turning everything and wiping down everything, which would take a while. So yeah, I guess this is just a video of process improvements, but I am genuinely very excited to solve this puzzle, and I expect I'll solve it a lot, so it'll also be a test of the longevity of all these things I'm doing, which I think is going to be really interesting. But yeah, I'm going to spray some clear coat on it, and then we'll sticker up the puzzle. Alright, it's the next day, and the clear coat has fully dried. Obviously, I sprayed this in 2 sessions, where I sprayed 3 of the faces, and then let it dry, and then sprayed the other 3 faces. It looks like these top and bottom layers got less affected by the clear coat, because this is still kind of rough. But, I mean, it did a decent enough job of bringing back the color. So, you'll see that on this face I did a thicker coat, which I wouldn't recommend. I think that the faces where I did thinner coats, like this one, turned out much better. So, don't overdo it, just spray it, make sure you have good coverage, but don't have like blobs of clear coat left, because this doesn't look that great. It'll be covered up by stickers anyway, so I don't think it matters that much, but yeah. And overall, I was also pretty not impressed with the drying time of the clear coat, so I think next time I do this, I'm going to try a trick that Jason suggested, which is to actually use a heat gun. He says that this will dry it in 20 seconds, and that would definitely be a big productivity boost. So next time I spray clear coat on a puzzle, if it's not too expensive, I'll hopefully have a heat gun by then. Another thing is, this clear coat did fuse together some of the pieces like a little bit, so all you have to do is just get your fingernail or like an X-Acto knife in there and split them apart, and it's all good. It's not any semblance of permanent, it's just something I thought I'd mention. So yeah, now I'm going to design a sticker template for this and cut out the stickers. After designing the sticker template based on the puzzle's actual model, I imported it into Silhouette Studio and then sent it to my Cameo 3 vinyl cutter. I use Oracal 651 vinyl material for the vast majority of my puzzles. In Silhouette Studio, I added an extra rectangle around each sticker template. This gives me kind of an outline of the sticker template that I can easily peel off the paper, and that allows me to more easily get at the actual stickers using the X-Acto knife. Later, you'll see that on the white side, it actually took some of the little stickers with them, and I was just too careless to notice, but I later went back and fixed that. But yeah, in general, stickering is the type of thing where you have to do it unless you make a stickerless puzzle, and there's really no quick way of doing it, right? Like, you have to put on every single sticker. I have mentally toyed with the idea of trying to learn to use transfer tape for this, but honestly I'm not sure if all of my puzzle surfaces are even enough to do it. But you know what? I'm sure that in several videos you'll see me trying out transfer tape, because stickering is genuinely quite a big time sink. The actual cutting process doesn't take that long, and you can't really get around that because of the vinyl cutter. But actually putting the stickers on the puzzle takes longer, and is not something you can really improve manually, so that's just another thought I've had. But anyway, while stickering does make for a quite satisfying time lapse, doing it in front of the camera actually makes it much more frustrating. So I'm gonna finish stickering the rest of the Square-3 off camera, and then I'll take it outside and we'll see how it turned out. All in all, I think the Square-3 turned out acceptably. It's a bit stiffer than I would want it to be, so I might need to revisit the clearances in this mechanism. And if I were to design this puzzle again, which is weird to say considering I designed it only a week ago, I would definitely try and increase some fillet radii to see if I could maybe get some corner cutting out of this mechanism. But of course, it's a perfectly usable puzzle, as this mechanism has been tested extensively in previous puzzles in the past. I have solved the Square-3 a few times already, and while I don't have full thoughts on the experience just yet, check the final thoughts for that, it's definitely a unique experience with its own quirks. I'm genuinely looking forward to getting a better grasp of how to solve the puzzle consistently. With regards to my experiments in building it, as of currently, the puzzle still smells a bit of clear coat, although I'm told that should go away within a few days. And none of the stickers have fallen off, but honestly I don't think they would have fallen off even if I didn't sand anything at all. It's honestly too early to tell if the experiments have been successful. It honestly feels kind of weird to me that it's taken me this long to actually build a Square-3, considering that all the way back in 2018 I actually printed a Square-4. Admittedly, that wasn't designed by me, but I think it's going to be really nice to be able to complete the series of square puzzles up until now. Sometime later this year, I'm actually planning to design and build a Square-5, so finally going to be continuing the series. But anyway, let's scramble the Square-3, and then afterwards see how it solves. Upon first glance, the Square-3 looks like it might actually solve similarly to the Waterfall Cube Supreme. Both puzzles have split Square-1 type edges and split Square-1 type corners. There is a major difference though, and that relates to the Waterfall puzzles internally having 3x3 cuboid geometry, while the Square puzzles have 2x2 cuboid geometry. This results in the split corners and split edges of the Waterfall Cube Supreme being chiral, meaning they are mechanically mirror images of each other, but not identical. However, on the Square-3, both halves of each corner and both halves of each edge are actually mechanically the same, so they can get into a more diverse variety of positions compared to their Waterfall Cube Supreme counterparts. The Square-3 solve has two main parts. First, we reduce it to a Square-2 by pairing up all of the edge halves. Then we just solve it as a Square-2 and we're done. The Square-2 by nature has no illegal combinations, so there's no chance that Square-3 moves will result in an unsolvable Square-2. However, after solving this puzzle a few times, solving the Square-3 edges does have potential to be quite tricky. Let's see how it turns out. The first step is going to be pairing up all of the edges on the same face, much like when trying to return a regular square one to its cubic shape. You might be wondering why this seemingly simple step took so long, so let me quickly take a moment to introduce you to this puzzle's main issue from a solving perspective. If you have an odd amount of these half edges, then any big corners on either side of it won't be able to make any turns. For example, this cut line comes up in the middle of this corner, and you can see nothing actually matches up from this side to this side. You can only have matches on this side or on this side, but here, because of this odd amount, it's never going to happen. So because of that, it can actually be very frustrating to make movements around this puzzle, well, productively, when you have an odd amount of edge halves like that. So what I've seen is the best thing to look for is this scenario where you have a single cut line, and then 3 on one side and 1 on the other, and that way, if you have all of the others set up there, you can easily just turn them in, and then finally we have our desired effect of having all of the edges on a single face. So now, just like on a square one, we're going to split these up and make the puzzle into a cubic shape again. Alright, now that we're in somewhat cubic shape, the next step is going to be to flatten all of these edge halves. You'll see that this part actually isn't oriented correctly, neither is either of these. So the goal is to just swap parts around until all of them are flush with the surface of the cube, because then we could properly move them around the puzzle and set up some pairings. So basically, if I want to swap these two and these two, which I do because they're all wrong, I'm going to use Jap Sherfoyce's Square-2 algorithm, which will be posted here on the screen, but if you go to his website, he actually has it in letter notation. And here we are. You'll see that these two have been swapped and these two have been swapped. And for any of the sides where, for example, here one of them is oriented correctly, the other isn't, I'll just try and set up a turn so that in combination with other parts, eventually they'll all be either like this or flat like this. And if I have just one pair that's oriented incorrectly, I'll show you later what I can do with that. So I didn't need to do it here, luckily, but I'm still going to show you it anyway. So basically, if you have just one of these edge pairs where both of them are flipped and not in the correct orientation, there's actually a set of moves that I came up with that you can do. So what you'll actually do is offset this like that, vertical turn, turn that, vertical turn, bottom layer, vertical turn, realign, and that's it. You'll see that this here is actually now in the different orientation. And the thing about it is, this doesn't just swap them. This isn't like a free move, because if this were to just swap two parts, that would make the rest of this puzzle very easy. But no, this will essentially swap 4 parts around. 2 of them just happen to be switched around in terms of orientation. So let me undo that, and then we'll finally pair all of the parts by color and see whether or not we have to deal with parity. So I believe this is actually a situation where we have 3 sets of edges that are unpaired. We have 1, 2, and 3. Now the thing about this is actually probably the least common scenario you're going to encounter. You're either usually going to just have all of them paired, or you'll have 2 of them incorrect, and then you have to do the parity solution. But a 3 cycle is less common, and frankly I don't necessarily remember exactly what I did for it, because this is the least common scenario, but I'll try some stuff out and tell you if anything worked. So it's funny, I know that on a previous solve, I was able to solve the 3 wrong pairs of edges within just a few moves, honestly. And now I've somehow messed up badly enough that I now have just 2 pairs of unpaired edges. So honestly, for the best, because this saves me time, because I was going to have to show you the parity algorithm anyway, and now I might as well do it within the solve. So let's get to it. What I'm going to do is once again put all of the edges onto one face. And I just want to make clear, this isn't like an actual parity algorithm. This is more just my thoughts on this. I would love to have more time to spend on this puzzle and do like a proper analysis and figure out the most efficient parity algorithm, but I've been trying to work one out for genuinely like 3 or 4 days now, and I can't spend infinite time on this puzzle, so I'm honestly happy that I found at least a somewhat repeatable solution to it. So I'm almost done getting all of the parts on the same face. But this isn't actually going to be the configuration we want. This is just a good base configuration. But yeah, what you want to do now is split this apart, turn it back. So you have kind of this eye pattern. Maybe if this was turned the other way, then it would look more like an eye. But yeah, so this is where you want to start, and then you set this up so the vertical turn cuts off one part here and one part here, and then you turn by 90 degrees and do the same the other way. Yeah, so your goal is to have pretty much these 4 parts, well, half edges, in this pattern on this face, and the rest of them here. And now what you're going to do is Jap Sherfoice's part swap algorithm, but instead of doing it on a Square-2 corner, or even a Square-3 half edge, you're actually going to do it on 3 units worth of parts. So this is 2 units, this is 1, so we're going to swap this with this. And then the reason why we have all this set up here is for ease of movement, we're actually going to use these 3 and these 3 as well. So yeah, this is pretty simple. We're just going to do the algorithm and then get it back into cubic shape and resolve everything, and the parity should be solved. I've tested this a few times and it works reasonably well enough. To explain why this works, here's an artist's rendition of the affected pieces. You can see the top layer at the top left and the bottom layer at the bottom left. The moral of the story is, this sequence of moves performs an odd amount of part swaps. In a perfect world, if we were able to just swap two half edges, then we could just do that, right? And then that would be an odd amount of part swaps. But we can't do that due to the puzzle's limitations in its physical state. So instead we do the next best thing, which is an odd amount of total swaps, thus meaning that when you bring all of the edges back into the cubic shape, they should be solvable. You will notice that this is a different shape from where we actually left it, so it's not trivial to just return it back to where it was. You do have to do some maneuvering. And it's not going to be fun because remember what we said about odd amounts of pieces making moves difficult? As a quick side note, here you actually get to see a real-world example of that algorithm I showed you a while back, where if you have just one of these pairs that are flipped the wrong way, you can simply do this sequence of moves to fix it. And here we are. All of the edges are in the correct shape. Now let's pair them up and make sure that the parity sequence of moves worked. And if it doesn't, I'm actually going to Alright, so we technically have a 3-cycle again, which as you can see, this is unsolved, this is unsolved, and this is unsolved. So I do feel vindicated because a 3-cycle is considered to be adjacent to everything being solved, and my previous failure to convert it as such is irrelevant. So at the very least, the parity algorithm worked. It just did dump me into where I was stuck earlier and messed up. So I'll get back to you with a more definitive method of solving the 3 wrong edges into the correct ones. Alright, after way too much time, I figured out a method of solving this 3-cycle. I don't even know if it's a 3-cycle. I'm just saying that because it's 3 pairs of edges that are wrong. But yeah, I'm gonna do this, and then I can't wait to be done with these little edges for a while. For such an easy puzzle to build, the Square-3 is insanely tricky if you don't get these all right from the start. Alright, so the first thing I'm gonna do is Japscher-Fuiss's algorithm on these pairs. And then I believe I do a double top turn, and then I do my own algorithm. And then I do the double turn again, and then I do my own algorithm again. Alright, I've done it correctly, so now instead of having one 3-cycle, I have two 2-cycles. So these need to switch, these need to switch, and that's trivial to solve. You know, there's a difference between solving a puzzle for yourself and feeling obligated to solve it for yourself within a time limit, and then simultaneously do that in an intelligible enough way to explain to people exactly what you're doing. I don't know if it's made me enjoy this puzzle less, and frankly I doubt it had that much of an effect, because what's the point of building a puzzle if you're not going to solve it? That's my philosophy of why I even show all the solves. But what I will say is I will be very glad to solve this and then not touch it for a while. Edges are done. Okay. So this is now fully reduced to a square 2. There are several methods for solving a square 2. The first one is to just move all the parts around. The second one is to try and reduce it to a square 1. After essentially just reducing all of this nonsense to a square 2, I don't have the patience for another reduction, so I'm just going to solve it using the square 2 brute force method. The core of this method is to get all of the white parts on one side and all of the yellow parts on the other, and essentially just swap parts around using 3 sets of moves. You can use Schurfuiss's algorithm just on these corners. You can use them on pairs of corners, or you can use that square 1 algorithm where you swap these two and these two. So that's kind of the approach I'm going to take for solving this the square 2. But first, obviously, I have to get all the white and yellows onto their appropriate sides. Alright, white and yellow colors are solved. Now I'm going to, I guess, start with probably the white side. There's really no reason to choose either of them. One thing you have to keep in mind is because these corners are split, you have to bear in mind where they are with regards to color scheme. Alright, so when I said I'd do the white side first, that actually wasn't true. I just did both sides simultaneously, and it turns out that the white side got done later. So I'm going to just keep the yellow on the same axis the whole time, and only work with the white side now. And these pieces will keep getting swapped back and forth. Alright, last iteration of this algorithm, and then I am not turning the Square-3 for a hot amount of time. That took way too long. To be fair, most of my frustration with this puzzle was with figuring out that parity sequence of moves. I don't even want to call it an algorithm, because it isn't one, right? It's not a parity algorithm. But anyway, let me collect my final thoughts, and then I'll get back to you with closing remarks on this puzzle. The Square-3 is a very interesting puzzle, and it's really taken me too long to finally get out and build one. In my demonstration, I mentioned that turns are a bit more stiff than I would want them to be, but from the solves I've done, the puzzle has definitely broken in even more and now turns really smoothly. However, after solving it, I really wish the puzzle was able to corner cut even a little bit, because it's the type of solve where you'll often be doing repetitive algorithms, so being able to do them quickly would be a huge benefit. I really wasn't gentle with the Square-3, and the stickers seem to be holding up pretty well. Take that as you will. The solve is fascinating and frustrating at the same time, but definitely rewarding once you're finally done. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.